All right. So I just mentioned we're going to cover fixtures in Django. So we're going to, does anybody know what a fixture is? By any chance, I kind of gave some subtle hints to it. Um, a fixture is something in Django that we can use to get data into our database. So that was something I came across when I was going through the cohort myself. Is you'll find ways to get connected to these APIs, and then you start to collect this data. Um, but then when there's data that you want to store, what happens, or how do you deal with storing a lot of data? And I do want to just preface this with just because I'm talking about fixtures doesn't mean, oh, I've got to get a fixture in my Django database to get something started. It's not really a necessity, but you'll see here in a minute why it's pretty useful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And give me 1 second, open up my code editor. So we're going to fast forward, and I've collected some data here. And so we're at the point where we now have all this data and we want to get it transferred into our Postgres database so that we can use Django to interact with it on our back end. So we got a lot of data here. You can tell I wouldn't want to write something, although in a lot of ways I did write a bunch of code to get this data put together and to use it in the fixture. But ultimately, this is what a fixture looks like. The end result is, if you look at it, it is pretty much just JSON, right? But there's a couple extra things in here. So you could think of these as just being your standard objects that represent the classes that you're trying to fill out for whatever table it is that you have described for the ORM. And sorry, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. So basically we have some extra fields here. You've got model, primary key, and fields. And then this is what is describing to Django basically what to do with your fixtures. This is letting Django know, hey, these objects aren't just regular objects. They're objects for this route app. The route app has some sport climb model, essentially. So we're just going to minimize this for now. And I'm sure I'll do my best to not take forever typing and stuff, but I actually want to just try and start the Django project from scratch, just so that we can pretty much see or give you guys kind of a view of how I code when I'm doing things. And yeah, also I remember having like a lot of confusion with starting a project in general and things to check for. So I'm going to go ahead and make a directory, and I'm just going to call this climbing because we're getting some climbing data. And then I'm just going to cd into that. And then the first thing we're going to do is just get our virtual environment started. And then once we've got our Vim made, we're going to install our dependencies. So we're going to need Django. We're going to need scop.g binary to talk to Postgres. And we're going to need Django REST framework. And that should be everything we need for this. We'll watch those go through. And then once you install your dependencies, you can always check pip list and see your dependencies. But this is the point where you've got all the stuff that you need for your project. So you would go ahead and pip freeze requirements.txt. Oh, if I could type pip freeze requirements.txt. And then you can see now we've got that file so that if somebody were to clone this down and wanted to pick up where we just started, it would be easy for them. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our project now. Oh, actually, hold off 1 second. I'll close. Let's actually start the Django project. So we'll do Python -m Django start project, and then we'll do climbing. And then I'm going to add this dot that's going to make sure that we ls, you'll see the files got dumped into this climbing folder. It's probably confusing. I don't think I should have done a climbing project into a climbing directory, but we're here now, so that's okay. But we should be able to, now that we've got this going, py run server, we can run our server, and really you don't really have to check that, but it just lets you know, okay, I've got everything set up. You don't want to do any migrations or anything at this point yet. We're going to make an API today. So how have we done views or anything like that? I know we talked a little bit today. I know the question was asked about an app. Do we understand what a app is versus the project?
Yeah, I don't think we haven't done views yet, but I know
Okay.
that apps are just multiple apps can be in a project.
Yeah, well, and then you'll notice like your project you can kind of think as like your parent, but your apps will also, they'll have models and views and other things, and your project will have your settings. But because we're going to make a view, we're going to make an app real quick. So to do that, you run, it's Python manage.py start app, and then I'm going to call it routes because that's what a bunch of that data is. And so if we look, climbing is our project, and our routes app has been made. So now we can go ahead and open up our project. And the first thing we need to do is we need to go to the settings. And because we just created an app, we need to add it to the installed settings. Otherwise, Django will get upset with us. Have you guys seen setting up a database for Django, the Postgres? I know we've Dockerized out, so I'm going to copy some kind of boilerplate stuff in, but basically we just ran this a second ago. And if I try to run this, now that I've switched this to a Postgres database, let's just go ahead and do that. Oh, I actually might have a Postgres database set up. That should fail because there's not, there is one running. Sorry, let's see. Okay, that's what we expected to see, and that's because we don't have a Postgres database. I just left one running, unfortunately. So to get that set up, I already put in the settings in Django for us. Sorry, let's get this terminal window back. And we need to get our Docker compose file in here. So touch Docker compose .yml. And then same thing, I've got that Docker image that I can just copy over. And we kind of checked ahead of time by accidentally leaving one running, but we can run our Docker compose and let our database start. And then it wouldn't be a bad idea to just try to connect to the database and verify that everything is set up right. And you'll see here that we've got some migrations and stuff. Don't worry about that for now. Generally, you'll want to kind of set up your models and make sure your schema is right, and then do your migrations. It doesn't mean that you have to wait, so I don't want you to get confused about that. But all it's letting us know is that we need to make some migrations and that some aren't applied. So it's just a reminder. So the next thing we're going to do is actually make the models for the route, and I've got that. I'll copy that in so you guys don't have to watch me type. Ooh. Okay. And so now that we've got a model, and we should be able to do our migrations now. So now that that is loaded, let me get my other file because I just want to show you guys for the fixture. If you notice these, give me 1 second. Okay, can you guys see the JSON for that? All right. Or sorry, the fixture fields. But if you notice, we pointed the fixture, we told it that the routes app was going to have a sports climbs model. And then we told it the primary key of every object that we wanted it to make in the database. And then also our fields line up with the crag name and everything. So to make something like this, I'm not going to go through the whole function, but you can kind of get the gist of I wrote a bunch of loops and read some data. And then when I had most of my data together, I wrote one for loop that is incrementing the primary key and then just setting up your data the way that it needs to be loaded. And so the advantage for that is now we can go to this routes app that we have and we can just make a fixtures folder. And once we make that, we can just drag our fixture over and we can rename this. I'm just going to call it TN for short. These are a bunch of rock climbing routes in Tennessee. And now if I go back to my terminal window, this is where we initially made our migrations. So another thing that we can do now is now we can do Python manage.py. And for a fixture, it would be load data. And then it would be the name of the fixture without the extension. So I just do TN here. And then you'll notice we just loaded 1,849 objects into the database. So that's the advantage if you can get a script or setup working. One thing to keep in mind is it is kind of, some people get the idea that because this is just an object and I can update it, then I can kind of like reuse it a bunch. It's meant to be kind of like a permanent thing. It's to set up your database or help seed it. But you don't like add and remove and then add again a fixture or something like that. It really makes complications, especially if there's, we talked about associations and relationships today. If you think about if all these things are related to these IDs and then you make them disappear or change and then load them back in, how would that work? And it wouldn't work that well. Okay, so now the exciting part. So we got a bunch of data in here. What's a good way that we can check basically? Because the API is what we're going to build, but that's definitely jumping a few steps.
You could just go into the database and
We
all.
could go into the database. One thing that will be somewhat easy, but also because I have a cheat sheet of what I need to type out, is we could check the Django shell basically. Um, so we could do Python manage.py shell and get into the interpreter. And so then we can do from routes.models and import sport climbs. And so now we have sport climbs in here, and trying to think, we did Tennessee climbs. I should look at the data. So Denny Cove routes at Denny are equal to sport climbs dot objects dot filter crag, and then it would be Denny Cove. And we didn't see any errors, which is good for something like that. But yeah, as you'll see, we selected an area. And so this is kind of the idea behind the view and the API that we're about to get to. Because you'll notice these are a bunch of sport climb objects, kind of. I mean, I can open up my terminal a little bit more, but it tells you an object, but it doesn't really look like an object, right? And that is intentional. It's not. If you look up here, you'll notice they call it a query set, and it is a query set. It just means that it's structured differently. I can't at a high level speak on it, unfortunately. But the important part to remember is that you can serialize a query set, and so that's how we handle it. Django will give us a query set, and then when we want to use that or send it somewhere else, we serialize it first, and then we send that data. So we're actually just going to jump into all of that in just 1 second. I'm going to quit the shell here, and then the first thing we'll do is go over to our view and get ready to import a few things, of course. So I'm just going to copy paste some stuff in because it'll be easier to talk about. And so your view is going to be a class that you make, and this class function is going to be what responds to requests. So a request comes through, and Django knows about it, and Django knows to call this function in response to that request. And so then this view, its job basically is to handle that request. I know that sounds a little confusing. It'll make probably a little bit more sense here in a second. The API view, just know that this is a special type of view, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more. I don't want to just overload on stuff today. But this def get is, we're defining a method that will handle get requests, and requests, like I was saying, requests are going to be what comes through to Django, and that request can include data. It doesn't always have to include data, but if it does, it will be in request.data. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to send a request to this endpoint with some data, just like we did in the shell, to tell it to give us all of the climbs at Denny Cove. And so by doing that, we can pass that in and then query, just like we did in the shell. It almost looks identical. I asked for the sport climbs, and I wanted to filter them by the crag, and that this isn't complete. But that's because we're going to change it a little bit. I want to show a couple things with serializers, even though it's like there's some things that I'm trying to work on understanding better myself, but it helps to know we're going to change these imports, and we're going to use a built-in serializer first. And since we have these like different views, we'll be able to see kind of why it was helpful or why it wasn't helpful, and what it was doing. But for now, we're going to leave this set up like this. The big difference here is we're importing a serializer. Um, we'll get we'll get back to that in just a second. So now we have a view here, and this view is set up. It returns a response. So we need to go and set up our routes that let Django know where this view is. So if we go to our settings, or not our settings, but our project, one thing we'll have to add here is include, and this is just another method that Django provides that'll let us say where, sorry, not say where, basically help Django identify where our view function is that we wrote. So we can do path. Sorry. Sorry, my monitor is messing up with. Okay, there we go. Sorry, just trying to grab the copy paste to make it go a little bit quicker. So we have this path in here, and this is going to be, this is in our project URLs. And so this is the beginning of our endpoint. You could go to localhost 8000/admin, and that's set up by default when we run the project. But by putting this here and using includes is pointing to the routes directory or the routes app and saying that there's URLs here for it. There's currently not right now. So that's actually the next thing that we got to do is go to our routes and just make a new file called urls.py. And with that, we're going to copy in almost identically what we had before, but we don't have includes in this. But notice we import the function that we wrote in our view. So the thing that was handling the response, and our URL patterns, we define a path to it, which we could make this empty. And I'll talk about that later if anybody has questions. But right now, the way that this path is going to work is it's going to go from API v1 climbing routes, and then over to this routes URLs folder, and then sport climbs, and then slash. And then at that point, anything that matches that will trigger this view to respond. So let's see if we set everything up. So now we have our URLs. We do need our server to be running. And then we're going to open up Postman. If I could get. Okay. And so we just sent a successful request. And that's kind of the end goal with, you could think as a Postman, we use it as a tool and mock the browser a lot. So in the same kind of sense, if you're able to get this in Postman, then you should be able to get this on your front end. And now you have all this data to use. But now back to what I was talking about with the serializers is if you look at this data, there's actually a lot of extra stuff included. That there's like the model, PK, and fields, and it's not formatted very nicely. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we're using that built-in serializer in our views. So if we took this out, then we wouldn't have either of these, and we wouldn't need the JSON. But the issue is we still need to have a serializer to use. The nice thing is that it's not very hard to make a custom one. Inside the routes app, you can make another file called serializers.py. And inside that, you can import serializers from REST framework, and then you need the model that you're trying to serialize. And then where we have fields down here, you can actually specify which fields you would like to show. So if I didn't want model and PK to show, I could list all of the other fields besides that. This under all is a lazy way of saying I want you to show all of the fields. So we're going to switch this to this serializer. So we've now made this file, but the only thing is we're not using it. So we need to import it. So from .serializers, import sport climb serializer. It helps a lot to follow convention with your serializer name is probably whatever model it's serializer. You don't necessarily have to, but it helps with remembering. So if you look in our view here, once we figure out what crag is in the request, we're trying to get a query of wherever those climbs are. And that's like the hint here is that this thing's always going to give us back a query set. We're going to search the database for something, and when we search it, Django is going to help us search it, but it's also going to give us back a query set. So we handled it before with the built-in serializer. Now to do it, it's pretty similar. We'll define something to use it, and then do sport climbing serializer, and then pass in the query set. In this case, though, we'll talk about this more later at another point, but we're not just serializing one sport climbs object. And so it doesn't have anything to do with many-to-many relationships or anything like that, but it can get confusing. You do need to put many equals true here, and that many is just talking about like the actual count, like more than one. So if it's going to be something that's going to return more than one of a class object in Django, and you're serializing it, then you have to let the serializer know that you want to serialize more than just one of those. That tripped me up for a little bit. And then, so now that we're using a serializer that way, we should actually just be able to get serializer data. Ooh, if I can type. And now we'll go ahead and hit this endpoint again. And you'll notice it's formatted in a much more readable fashion. And this is really just the start of this. You can really read up more, and it is probably worth it to some extent. I wouldn't say it's super crucial, but in this serializers.py, there's other things you can define here, like methods and stuff that can help interact and make your data appear in a different way, or if you wanted to hide certain fields for some reason. But I just bring it up where that's the advantage of using your customized serializer is you do a little bit more work, but by default, it's pretty readable. And then on top of that, there's other things that you can customize to extend this essentially. And going back to the views thing, this is kind of the whole idea is we get a request, we figure out how we're going to handle that request. Maybe we need to talk to the database, maybe we don't. And then we return our response, and then we'll essentially have many of these and many apps that make up the application. But for the most part, they're all just doing that. One view handles one thing, ideally. But yeah, you guys got any questions? Was anything confusing, or yeah, did I go too fast? Or it was rough trying to trying to type everything, but at the same time, I know I was very confused when I was getting into Django with how many folders there were opening up and where and what you could make for files. So maybe that'll be some of the benefit of having it recorded, is just to go look at it again. All right. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Cool. Thank you very much.